Playing the Game of Thrones requires adept and intelligent decision-making. Characters constantly weave through minefields of lies, deception, and schemes. So let's rank this riveting display of smart plays, since it's such a core foundation of the show, and along the way, we can reminisce on how witty everyone used to be. Starting at number 20, I'm going to put forth a rather controversial pick, and it's Cersei exploding the Sept. The reason being, looking at it from an angle of intelligence, the consequences of this action would basically be the end of Cersei. Nuking one of the most holy places in the world and killing the beloved Marjorie and High Sparrow would spawn the biggest uprising Westeros has ever seen. Cersei could maybe overcome this by spreading mass misinformation, silencing opposition, and gaslighting everyone into believing she didn't do this, but since we don't actually see this campaign, I can't meaningfully put this play any higher than number 20. And the reason it's mainly here is because of the immense short-term benefits of wiping out all of her opposition in one move, going from being screwed and getting cast out to becoming the Queen of King's Landing. It's just wholly and utterly contrived by not focusing on the fallout of this decision, and even including this play on my list feels very generous. Number 19. Tywin saving King's Landing from Stannis. This is a groundbreaking decision that saves the entire city, and had Tywin not have done this, the story would have played out very differently. However, the reason why I have this play at number 19 is that, in terms of Tywin's available options, this was really his only good choice. Robb Stark was going on a relentless win streak, so he was already forced into a position where he needed to retreat. Naturally, retreating to King's Landing to thwart Stannis' invasion was by far his smartest option, despite what all of these brainlets were saying to Tywin. It allows him to take one of his opponents unaware in a dynamic war front with so many enemies on the board. Had Stannis put aside Robb's treason of siding with Renly, and they collaborated in attacking King's Landing, then the Lannisters would have been screwed. Number 18. Tyrion's Myrcella scheme. Nothing insane from a macro standpoint in how this alters the continent, but I think this is just a quick and brilliant way to weed out enemies among us on the small council, easily manipulating the already established titans within King's Landing. I think this alone is such an interesting contrast to Ned Stark, who kind of came in bumbling and blind while Tyrion hits the ground running. And even despite this being a facade, I think all three of his marriage proposals were pretty good, besides trying to ally with the Iron Islands. Tyrion is genuinely intending on one of these three proposals sticking, so each of them are pretty well thought out. Truly a scene that makes you love Tyrion Lannister and makes you long for his character to be more like this in the later seasons. Number 17. Tyrion befriending the Mountain Clans. Ah, another ingenious Tyrion play. This scene is so impressive to me because Tyrion entirely reverses a situation in which he was surely going to die to turning the Mountain Clans into being his allies. And more than that, in people willing to remain loyal to Tyrion, even in King's Landing. Tyrion quickly understanding what their true wants are, and being able to exploit that with far-reaching promises, all while dismantling the tension with clever humor, is just peak Tyrion for me. Perfectly personifying his quick wits and how he can get out of any situation with what he says. Number 16. Tywin securing Sansa's marriage. At first I thought this would be higher, but Tywin efficiently decimates Olenna so quickly that it barely even seemed like a struggle for him, simply just threatening to assign Loras Tyrell to the Kingsguard and thus solidifying that she'll never have an heir again. Something that Tywin knows all too well. This is also a pretty major change from the books in which Loras actually joins the Kingsguard. It doesn't really matter that much because he actually has brothers, whereas in the show, David and Dan basically cut out every non-essential character in the story. So because of this change, it definitely makes sense for Tywin to threaten Loras and kind of exposes Olenna's key weakness in that she'll do anything to protect the main heir to Highgarden. Number 15. Littlefinger killing Lysa Arryn. This is a little weird to rank because, as it happens in the show, it's very spontaneous and Peter's hand is kind of forced. However, I think he is obviously intending on getting rid of her eventually. This just isn't the most ideal situation to do it. Another major issue that kind of makes this smart play contrived is how easily the Vale Lords accept that this was an accident. All it takes is one easily corruptible and biased witness to sway everyone. She does reveal that she's Sansa Stark, but still, that doesn't mean she's suddenly a reliable witness. In the books, it's so much more interesting because this is a massive point of contention for Littlefinger. He has to bribe people, try to make compromises, and it's such an impressive storm of decisions that somehow lands Littlefinger in a favorable position. While for the show, this conflict quickly brushes off like a brittle snowflake. Number 14. Jon saving the wildlings. This wasn't something at first I immediately considered as a smart play, but this is a major choice that fundamentally reshapes the Long Night. Jon deep down knows the right decision despite all the hate for the free folk in the Night's Watch. Seeing him break off of that and saving this community is what defines Jon's character. Also, Jon's utter bravery in walking straight into this hostile environment to confront people he recently betrayed is so selfless and indirectly genius because it kind of buys the respect of the free folk. This man is putting himself in a position where he'd most likely die just to try and save them. Number 13. Littlefinger winning over the Tyrells. By pure virtue that the Tyrells are one of the most major houses on the continent, I think Littlefinger bringing them to the Lannisters for an alliance should land this play into my list by default. Arguably one of the best and most influential plays, and there are two reasons for this play not being higher on my list. Firstly, it feels kind of cheap for David and Dan to rob Tyrion of coming up with this point, since it was originally his idea in the books. The fact that there's no small council discussion about the state of the Tyrells in the show is kind of crazy when you think about it. Instead, and this is also the other issue, Littlefinger just happens to be at Renly's camp when this all goes down, giving him an easy and free opportunity to seize the Tyrells. I'm fine with this being a coincidence, but this now raises a couple issues of Peter was just in King's Landing at the end of the last episode, so he's basically fast traveling here. And secondly, there's no way Tyrion would trust Littlefinger to do anything in proximity to Renly. His actual task is bringing forth a scheme to Catelyn at the behest of Tyrion, but it's a massive oversight to give Peter a free opportunity to converse with Renly and potentially betray them. But hey, don't think about that. The earlier seasons are perfect and have no flaws. Number 12. Jon becoming a wildling spy. Almost overlooked this moment since it was pretty spontaneous, but Qhorin Halfhand makes the absolute best of a terrible situation. They go from two meaningless deaths to buying Jon a one-way ticket into being able to spy on the free folk, and the only price is slightly changing the way one of them dies, convincing them that Jon is a turncloak and betrayed his brother, while also establishing that Jon bested one of the most revered rangers. This does also technically and is slightly dependent on Ygritte protecting Jon, but I think this is still a pretty miraculous moment for the Night's Watch that reshapes their general trajectory by a huge margin. Number 11. Jaime wins the Siege of Riverrun. Really one of the only moments from the last 3 seasons that I'd actually consider as a smart play, in large part due to David and Dan adapting this plot point from A Feast for Crows, so that's probably not a coincidence why it's one of the only moments. But Jaime essentially enters what is otherwise an extremely difficult predicament. Overwhelming the castle will lead to major casualties, and the Freys have basically squandered any of their bargaining power with their empty threats of killing Edmure. So Jaime actually turning his attention to Edmure and intelligently clocking that the men of the castle will listen to him over Brynden was excellent. And the way he convinces Edmure to submit to him is one of the coldest and most brutal moments from Jaime, promising to give his child an actual life while simultaneously threatening to catapult said child over the walls of Riverrun if he doesn't comply, thus slipping back into his Kingslayer persona to scare the living shit out of Edmure. Such a cool solution to a siege that generally doesn't have a lot of viable options to solve. Number 10. Davos securing a loan from the Iron Bank. Not a major iconic moment in comparison to others on this list, but that doesn't by any means detract from how impactful and smart this play was. Arguably, and I think by far actually, marking Davos' most intelligent play. Stannis was in a position where he was running out of food, was hemorrhaging troops and support from his allies, so Davos coming out of left field with the idea of going to Braavos to get funding from the Iron Bank was brilliant, bringing forth the argument that Stannis is indisputably the best king currently on the continent. And because Davos ends up getting this loan for Stannis, it single-handedly re-energizes his entire war effort into having a second chance, making him easily one of the best hands. Number 9. Daenerys inciting a slave uprising in Meereen. She kind of does this twice, but I'll pick the Meereen version of this since it's a bit more fleshed out. Instead of trying to break down the walls of the city with her catapults, it's a pretty creative decision to instead launch the broken manacles from the slaves Dany freed prior, thus instilling this optimistic and rebellious urge that's awaiting to be ignited by the smallest of sparks. So all Dany really has to do is sneak in a couple of people through the sewers and actually incite this revolution. She's directly tackling the city's exploit in the massive difference in numbers of slaves to masters and using that to her advantage, sacking one of the greatest kingdoms without even laying a scratch on it. This moment, and of course other past moments throughout her reign in Essos, really establishes her as an intelligent and forbearing leader. Number 8. Varys subverts Littlefinger stealing Sansa. This is particularly in Season 3 because Littlefinger still technically does get her in Season 4. For this scheme though, it goes very deep and is pretty elaborate. Varys first goes after Ross and recruits her into feeding him information, to which he finds out that Littlefinger intends on secretly taking Sansa away in one of his ships. And to circumvent that, Varys goes the elaborate route of not going to Cersei, but instead Olenna, with the plan of her trying to give Sansa a reason to stay and to marry Loras Tyrell. And then Sansa ultimately rejects Littlefinger and chooses to stay in King's Landing. That's some good shit, and imagine if Varys had any kind of scheming to this degree in the later seasons instead of being a glorified messenger. To me, this is essentially prime Varys, and I really wish David and Dan kept in the even deeper scheming that he was up to in terms of working with Dorne and Illyrio. Number 7. The betrayal of Ned Stark. Pretty crazy that this is only at number 7 and I'm primarily just looking at this singular play instead of Littlefinger's macro plan. This moment is the perfect encapsulation of what Game of Thrones is and showcases how no matter what happened, Littlefinger would have come out on top. He's basically untouchable at the height of his power if he's not actively being written as a moron.
I'm a bit confused.
Littlefinger wanted Ned to side with the Lannisters and worst case scenario name Renly King if Joffrey ever became too insane. However, since Ned is honor-bound, he was insistent on Stannis being king. The issue here for Littlefinger is, under Stannis, he can't meaningfully thrive in that environment because, realistically, Stannis would at best expel him from the Small Council or at worst, execute him for treason. This leads him to want the Lannisters in control because he can easily manipulate them, he already has their good favor, and can rise to power quickly in his current position. He has a lot to gain here, whereas, this other scenario he loses everything. Looking at it from that perspective, you can see why Littlefinger quickly betrays Ned, along with that fundamental dislike he has for him given their past. So bamboozling him at the last second and thus proving his loyalty to the Lannisters even more was masterfully done. Number 6. Stannis coming north to help the Night's Watch. Alright, now hear me out. I know this may seem very high, but there's a lot here that benefits Stannis drastically, to the point that it makes this play genius level in a vast sea of options, and there's 3 reasons why this is the best one. Firstly, Stannis needs to win the North as a whole. He needs to bolster his reputation by first defeating the King Beyond the Wall, solidifying that he's actually being a true king of Westeros because he's helping keep the peace and protecting his subjects, unlike the people currently running it into the ground. This also helps achieve his other overarching objective of making sure the Night's Watch is intact for the long night. Secondly, and this is the biggest reason among everything in that, Stannis is really hedging on Jon accepting and becoming Jon Stark, thus completely winning over the North in its entirety, and most of the houses would most likely turn on the Boltons at that point. On a technicality, most of the North didn't support Jon in season 6, but that was more because he had a small army of wildlings and he was the losing side. For Stannis, this would have been the opposite, but in general, Jon saying no was a massive blow and was very surprising to Stannis. Then lastly, and this is more of a Hail Mary, Stannis had the possibility of adopting the wildlings into his army. He brings forth a pretty good proposal, but since Mance is way too stubborn, that unfortunately doesn't fly. And there's also an additional positive in the books where Stannis recruits the mountain clans, although that's more of a Jon idea. So considering all of these aspects and how many things Stannis could have done in Westeros as a whole, I think accruing 3 to 4 possible positives is a great path to pursue. It just unfortunately didn't work out very well since every play at the end of the day can have a gambling factor baked in. And when it comes to that lottery, Stannis got shafted. Number 5. The Blackwater Explosion. Easily the most insane play that Tyrion makes. You can't really dispute that without this action, they still would have won. At first I didn't think this should be classified as a very smart play because, oh, Tyrion had wildfire at his disposal, so it's kind of a no-brainer to use it in some capacity. But then I remembered that Tyrion had to discover this information, specifically through an entire plot in which he corrupts Lancel to spy on Cersei, to which he finds out that the Pyromancers have been working overtime, and Cersei intends to use the wildfire in makeshift pot grenades, which is a terrible idea. Instead, Tyrion enacts his own scheme. We don't need to engage Stannis in naval warfare. That's basically a forced loss given his legendary status during the Greyjoy Rebellion, where he defeated Victarion Greyjoy in the Sea Battle of Fair Isle. So let's make a literal nuke and send it into his fleet to detonate. Pretty miraculous idea, and it even goes farther in the books in which Tyrion constructs a long line of metal chains that traps the ships in Blackwater Bay so that any ship that wasn't engulfed in the initial explosion would still eventually succumb to fire being spread from other ships, along with just everything crashing together in absolute chaos. Even without that in the show, it's still a top 5 play to me. Number 4. Joffrey getting poisoned. This scheme has a bit more layers in terms of everyone's motivations that I didn't initially fully consider. Remember how at number 8 I highlighted how Varys subverted a scheme in which Littlefinger was going to steal away Sansa? Well, really one of the main reasons why Littlefinger is doing this is because it easily gets Sansa into his possession without anyone knowing since he's not currently in King's Landing. It's one of the most elaborate and crazy schemes that essentially operates as a massive decoy for what he really wants. Although Joffrey's death does also benefit Peter in the sense that it destabilizes the realm even more to give him more opportunities. Then, past the motivation perspective, the planning of this was stellar. Planting the poison on Sansa so she easily smuggles it in, Olenna only having to pick a piece of it off to then poison Joffrey, and the biggest part of all of this is who the blame lands on. Like, since Littlefinger knows the deep disdain Cersei has for Tyrion, it's basically a guarantee that she'll falsely accuse him. And Tywin would also gladly see this mummer's farce get so out of hand to a point that he'd get to see his own personal objective of abolishing Tyrion from life in general. So what may otherwise be construed as a simple poisoning, I think it goes far deeper in terms of the methodical planning that was required for this plan to work as effectively as it did. Number 3. Whispering. The play that essentially solidifies that Robb Stark is a force to be reckoned with, sending a small portion of his army to confront Tywin, while he takes the main force across the Twins to liberate Riverrun from a siege, thus winning a key battle while also further bolstering his army with the support of Riverrun. This macro plan is great, and it essentially plays into the notion that Tywin and everyone is expecting Robb to be a green boy, someone who mindlessly rushes into battle. So he takes advantage of that assumption and puts forth a complex play that thoroughly pays off. Now, the actual Battle of Whispering Wood is actually originally a plan from Brynden Tully. In the books, he's introduced much earlier and is a part of Robb's war council. He basically sets up the notion of predicting Jaime's behavior of being restless restless and him wanting to deal with raiding parties himself, which is the entire framework of their trap, he specifically picks the location of the ambush, and he's commanding a few hundred scouts that are doing all of the work here. Brynden in this regard is an absolute Chad, and David and Dan mostly import all of that worth into Robb instead, making him a singular military mind. Also, this moment is so influential that even Jaime is referencing how he learned from this in Season 7, even though his application of that plan doesn't make any sense, but that's more of a failure on David and Dan than Jaime himself. Number 2. The Red Wedding. Wow, what a twist! The Red Wedding isn't number 1 on my list for once. Even still not being my personal top pick for the smartest play in the show, this is still a 4D chess play. Luring Robb into a trap so inconceivably evil that no one expects is just deviously smart. Like, Robb kind of suspects that something may be off, but he's hinging most of his safety on guessed right, and his general high sense of honor is blinding him to seeing the potential of human depravity. Everything behind the scenes for this plan is very impressive, primarily in the regards of Tywin orchestrating this event to where no traces lead back to him.
Walder Frey gets all the credit, or the blame, I suppose, depending on your allegiance.
Another aspect is him not only convincing the Freys, but also the Boltons, which simultaneously indirectly gets him back Jaime, since by this point Roose was turned to Tywin's side. This illustrates that there's also immense importance in information, politics, and complex house relations when it comes to war. Tywin is an expert in this regard, and is directly and meticulously exploiting Robb's internal blunders, leading to an outcome in which Robb loses the war, despite never losing a single battle. Dishonorable Mention. Tyrion's trial by combat. I'm just throwing this in because I know people will comment this, and I don't really think it applies as being a smart play. Primarily because it's really Tyrion's only option, and even then, he has no prospects for a suitable champion, so this operates as a desperate Hail Mary. Number 1. Littlefinger ordering the death of Jon Arryn. For the singular play, there's so much depth to it that it consumes an entire season-long mystery, and we still learn more about it even until season 4, when Lysa reveals that she poisoned Jon at Peter's request. There's a lot to unpack here in a short time, but Peter's goal is to destabilize the realm. Enacting the scheme sets forth a long domino chain he foresees that ultimately benefits him the most. Jon Arryn was the embodiment of competence, something that Littlefinger doesn't want, and he was also working with Stannis and uncovering the truth surrounding Cersei's children. The act of killing him was also extremely well thought out. Like, most people and even Pycelle assume that the Lannisters did it. So to protect the Lannisters, Pycelle opted to label this assassination as just being an illness, completely leaving no trail of suspicion towards Littlefinger. Then the biggest piece of his plan is a letter Lysa sends to Cat, declaring that the Lannisters killed Jon Arryn, which essentially marks the beginning of the feud between the Lannisters and the Starks. This is a long chain of events that I'm also simplifying, since it goes even further in terms of Peter setting up Tyrion, which spurs Catelyn into seizing him, and that results in Tywin going into military overdrive. And this is just looking at the war aspect of this plan, since killing Jon also frees Lysa into needing a husband, thus allowing Peter to eventually claim the Vale. Also, another aspect here is that had Jon Arryn revealed the true identities of Cersei's children, and given that he's a beloved and reputable source, House Lannister would basically be screwed. So this all goes back to Peter not wanting the Baratheons to be in control, and wanted the more incompetent Lannisters to bugger the realm for him to sack for his own gain. Those are what I'd say are the top 20 smartest plays in Game of Thrones. Let me know in the comments what your favorite plays are, and make sure to follow my Letterboxd, join my chill Discord community in which we've been talking a lot about Silksong, and I have a Patreon if you want to support the channel. Thanks to my incredible top patron, Logan Farmer.